We're here in Jerusalem. I'm currently on Mount Scopus, overlooking the old city. You can see the Dome of the Rock, and then to the east of the Dome of the Rock, you can see a valley that descends. That's the Kidron Valley. And I'd like to share a story of three different kings from the Bible. The first king is King David. And during the reign of King David, his son, Absalom, decided he wanted to try to overthrow his father. And so Absalom gathered his forces in Hebron and marched on Jerusalem. David, knowing this was going to happen, fled the city of David. He fled through the Kidron Valley and up and over the Kidron up to the Mount of Olives. And I'd like to read from 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 23. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over towards the wilderness. And David went up and ascended the Mount of Olivet, which is the Mount of Olives. And if we read in Psalms 23, it says, though I pass through the valley of the shadow of death. That is a Davidic psalm, a psalm by David that references, we believe, the Kidron Valley. And when he got to the Mount of Olives, David realized that his closest friend, his confidant, Ahithophel, had betrayed him. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 31, and one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So here we now have David's advisor, one of his closest friends, had betrayed him and had gone over to his son. And another psalm, Psalm chapter 41, verse 9, is another psalm of David where he references Ahithophel, and says, oh, it's just a little windy here, says these words, yea, mine own trusted familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. So there's the first story of David being betrayed as he passes Kidron. He goes up to the Mount of Olives. The second story is about King Hezekiah in about 750 BC. Hezekiah, descendant of David, several generations, his father, Ahaz, was unrighteous. And during the time of his father, the temple was either misused or in disuse. And so we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 what Hezekiah did when he became king. And it says, in the very first month of the first year of his reign, I'm reading in 2 Chronicles 29:3, he, Hezekiah, opened the doors of the temple, and he said to the Levites and the priests to clean it out, to sanctify the house of the Lord, and carry forth the filthiness out of the house. And reading further on in verse 16, the priests went into the inner house of the Lord, and they brought out all the uncleanness and that they found in the temple. And the Levites took it to carry it abroad into the brook Kidron. So where the Dome of the Rock is, that's where the temple stood, Solomon's temple. And so the priest took out all the filthiness, all the uncleanness, and threw it into the brook Kidron. In the next chapter, Hezekiah invites all of the tribes of Israel to come back and worship in Jerusalem. And they took all the altars in Jerusalem, and it says in 2 Chronicles 30, verse 14, they arose and took away the altars that were in Jerusalem, and all the altars of incense took they away and cast them into the brook Kidron. And then they sacrificed the animals. And at this time, the animal sacrifices, where would all the blood go from the temple? It would drain into the Kidron Valley. So that's the story of King Hezekiah. And the third story I want to share is about the King of Kings, who is Jesus Christ. We read in John chapter 13, Jesus Christ is going to complete his atonement here in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane is in the bottom of this Kidron Valley. Kidron means gloomy brook or black brook. And you could see where all the blood would drain down. And Jesus, knowing that he was going to be betrayed in John chapter 13, said this. John chapter 13, verse 18. Jesus said, I speak not of you all, I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Jesus has now referenced the very scripture about David and Ahithophel. And Jesus knew who was going to betray him, his close friend, Judas. And so there's a connection there. And unlike David, who passed the Kidron Valley up over the Mount of Olives and fled, Jesus passed through the Kidron Valley and he stayed. Unlike David, whose own son usurped the throne of his father David, the child of David attacked his father. Here, Jesus Christ sacrificed himself for all the children of men. And the last thing I'd like to read is from the scriptures is John chapter 18, right after John chapter 18 verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples to the brook Cedron, which is the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he entered with his disciples. And a modern day apostle by the name of Bruce R. McConkie said these words about what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I'll end with that. We do not know, we cannot tell what mortal mind can conceive the full import of what happened with Christ at the Garden of Gethsemane. We know he sweat great gouts of blood from every pore as he drained the dregs of that bitter cup. We know he suffered both body and spirit, more than it's possible for man to suffer. In Gethsemane, we see the Son of God ransom man from the temporal and spiritual death that came because of the fall. And now pertaining to this perfect atonement, wrought by the shedding of blood, I testify it took place in Gethsemane and Golgotha. As pertaining Jesus Christ, I testify he is the Son of the living God and was crucified for the sins of the world.